Hello, BookTube. We're in installment number 2 of our 2018 read-along of Homer's Odyssey. Not to be confused with our 2018 read-along of Homer's Iliad, or our upcoming 2018 mandatory buddy read. This is a totally different thing. This is when we're going through, week by week, Homer's more approachable epic. And when we left off last time, our hero, Odysseus, was washed up, naked, alone, covered in brine, hopeless, helpless, on the shores of the Phaeacians. He's met by the little princess Nausicaa and brought to the court, where he's treated as an honored guest, not only because I myself think that if you read a little bit between the lines, they know perfectly well who he is, but also because in ancient Greece, in ancient Greece literature anyway, strangers were treated with a lavish kindness because the idea was they could be a god in disguise, and then you'd be in trouble if you didn't do that. I've often thought that's a very good rationale for giving your guest everything, for being as good a host as you can be. But the 6 books that we read this time around find Ulysses in the court of the Phaeacians, and he is trying to keep a low profile. He's trying to be low-key. He's exhausted, first of all, and he's also a supplicant on their doorstep, and he knows it perfectly well, even though he himself is a king. There's a bard who tells stories, and he listens patiently, and we learn not our first real indication, but in this book, our second real indication that the stories of Troy have already become legend. We get a feel of that when we listen to the gods on Olympus talking about Troy, but here we see it for real, that the song of Troy, the bits and pieces of the story of Troy have entered the performance repertoire. They have become literature and legend, even though one of their chief architects is sitting there at the court. This, allegedly humble old man who, when athletic games are organized, is goaded into taking part in them, and of course outdoes the younger generation. And it's not purely a source of pride, because as I mentioned last time, that in Homer's view of the world, every generation is considerably weaker than the one before it. In the Iliad, when a character lifts a gigantic boulder on the battlefield, we're told that no one alive in the present time could lift such a big rock. And by the same token, in archery contests and whatnot, Ulysses is constantly remembering that he shouldn't be proud, because he himself is a mere fraction of the great archers that went before him. But he still outdoes everyone at court, even though he's this grizzled old guy. And eventually, a bard is brought in, who's named, and who tells stories about Troy that get to Ulysses. They get to him. They affect him, probably because this bard is very skillful. But one way or another, the king is sitting near to Ulysses throughout the whole thing, and sees clearly that his guest is affected in ways that don't have anything to do with the way the rest of the audience is affected. That the amazing truth of the matter is that a figure out of myth is sitting amongst them. He's sitting in the audience listening to this bard. And eventually he decides to tell the story himself. He decides to take up the story. He reveals who he is and decides to take up the story of his own adventures. And tells, in the course of these few books, in fact just a fraction of these 6 books, he tells what I would be willing to bet most people in the world consider to be the story of the Odyssey. Especially those of you who are coming to this for the first time can either confirm or deny that. But it's been my experience teaching this book that people, students, young people, old people who come to it for the first time, come to it with a set of stories in mind. And they're always a little bit bewildered that they get a long way into the poem before they ever encounter even a hint of those stories. and you get that in these 6 books. Once Odysseus takes up the story of his own voyages, then we get all the famous bits and pieces that everybody associates with this book. We get Circe changing his men into animals. We get the land of the lotus eaters, whose drugs will take away care or any impetus for the future. We get the sirens. We get Scylla and Charybdis. We get the Laestrygonians, who are savage cannibals. And we get, of course, famously, the Cyclops, who pens up Odysseus's men in his cave and starts eating them bit by bit in a classic callback to the Iliad. That scene, though, that incident with Cyclops recalls the way that this author can evoke gore like nobody's business, and the blinding of the Cyclops, and all of that is told in very short order. I've had first-time readers of this poem be amazed at how quickly all of that is over. You just expect it, if you come into the Odyssey just thinking about the Odyssey in your mind without ever having read it, you expect that the incident with the Cyclops is going to take a long time. You expect that the incident with Circe is going to take a long time, and it doesn't. And eventually, Odysseus' stories bring his recounting of his own adventures comes down to the horrible moment when they're on the island where the sun god pastures his cattle, and Odysseus' men decide to capture and butcher some of those cattle. Never a good thing to do, and it spells disaster. In an account of homecoming that has been heartbreakingly tantalizing, at one point in the stories that we're told, they get within sight of Ithaca. And then the greed and stupidity of Ulysses' men causes the ship to go off course and be blown almost back to its starting point. Maddening. And also a commentary, I think. It's impossible to read that now the way I think the audiences at the time would have heard it. I think they would have heard the constant, oafish, lecherous bumblings of the crew in a comedic way. I think that would have been comic relief. We can't do it now. All we can do now is think, well, aren't they? For veterans of Troy and people who've learned to trust their lives to this captain, isn't this weird behavior? But one way or another, they make the mistake of all mistakes to attack the cattle of the sun god, and they're destroyed for it. It's that story, that catastrophe that washes Odysseus up on Calypso's island. And then, as he says in the books that we're reading today, that's where he ends his story. He says, well, you already know that story, so why bother to tell you it again? Truculent behavior. You get the impression that maybe he's not happy telling his story. And there's a lot of folderol before, during, and after those key marquee signature stories of the Odyssey. There's all sorts of courtly behavior, fine people saying fine things in both directions, that I can't help but think strains the patience of a reader who's coming to this for the first time, and maybe a reader who's read it many times. Because it feels so off the point of what we're conditioned to think of through many children's retellings of this epic. We're conditioned to think of this as just a string of adventures, and it's not. It's actually much more complicated than that. And eventually, once the story is told, the decision that was never in doubt is enacted, and it is decreed that Ulysses will be sent home. That we end our 6 books this time around with our hero going home. And that also surprises first-time readers of the Odyssey. Most first-time readers of the Odyssey find it very surprising to realize that one half of the book takes place on Ithaca. That this is not just an endless tale of wanderings and adventure. And that's where we leave off for today. We leave off with Odysseus poised to go back home. Without any doubt in the matter at all. It's just a quick skip. It's not like the gods are going to interfere. It's not like the ships are going to sink. It's not like anything like that. It looks like a straight shot back to Ithaca, where he knows not what will wait for him. He knows nothing about it. Because he hasn't been given the kind of detailed prophecies from the one source where he could trust them. Because one of the big adventures that he recounts is his trip to the underworld, where he meets all kinds of famous people from myth and history, and also a bunch of people that he knows. Meets a crewman that he wasn't aware of, didn't know that he was unshriven on a foreign shore, meets the ghost of a great prophet, meets all kinds of people, including Achilles, who very famously, in a famous bit, tells him, I would rather have been born, lived, and died as an anonymous butcher, an anonymous farmer, than to have lived a famous life and be languishing here with these nerveless dead people. Even though he is one himself, he clearly doesn't think of himself as one, and that's the Greek underworld. He has nothing to look forward to. He has no future to look forward to other than just languishing. And the same thing is true for Hercules, whose spirit Odysseus meets in the underworld. Even though Homer tells us, well, it's his spirit, but kind of, sort of not, because it's a shade of him. But he is also living on Olympus. A clone of him is living on Olympus, having completely different experiences that are entirely happy. But nevertheless, to adhere to some sort of otherworldly paperwork, there has to be a ghost down in the underworld of anybody who's dead, even if they are somewhere else. The ghost is not happy. The ghost tells stories. We're told that the other dead version of Hercules in Olympus is happy. And we're also told a thing that always confuses me, which is that Hercules comes striding out of the darkness with his bow drawn. First of all, why on earth that would be true? But he instantly recognizes Odysseus, and I have no idea why. I have no idea how he manages to do that, unless he recognizes Odysseus because his heavenly counterpart recognizes Odysseus. But if that's the case, if they're sharing intelligence between each other, then, to put it mildly, I don't understand the Greek concept of the underworld, especially for heroes, and I don't think I ever will. It's like they want to both have their cake and eat it. It's like they want the underworld to be a misery, a place of endless tedium, but also for there to be a chance that you can transcend it. One way or another, Odysseus still doesn't know what he will encounter back home, even though he hears endless stories when he's in the underworld. And that is a strand. It's especially prominent in these 6 books, but it runs throughout this poem. I wanted to draw a little attention to it. I'm sure you noticed it yourself. And that is that this is a story about storytelling. We get it endlessly from everybody. Nobody just introduces themselves in this book. They tell stories, and sometimes the stories are elaborate lies. By the point we're at in this poem, Ulysses has already told many elaborate lies about himself and about others. And when he gets to Ithaca, he's just going to keep doing that. And the gods have told elaborate lies to themselves, to each other, about each other. And of course, the 6 books that we're reading today are the apotheosis of storytelling, where we get not only bards, but actually the participant himself telling his story. I think that's fascinating. There's nothing like that in the Iliad. There's nothing. The Iliad is concerned with other things, like the precise trajectory that eyeballs take when they are geysered out of someone's skull by a spear moving at Mach 1. This poem is starting to settle down. It's starting to settle down into telling stories. It's starting to settle down into what we would consider today to be metafiction. Because it's characters telling stories about their own stories, and they know perfectly well that those stories are already being told by other people, and maybe elaborated upon. I just think that's fascinating. It's a totally different tonal register than the Iliad, and I think probably the source of this book's greater popularity. People love just sitting in for a really good tale. But I'm curious to know if that was your impression, especially those of you who are reading this for the first time. But even if not, I'm loving the discussions that are cropping up in the comments field about these books that I love so much. I'd love to know what impression you had reading all these different stories, and especially Odysseus telling his own story. I found it, rereading it for this read-along, I found it even more fascinating. I love rereading this stuff every year, but reading it this time, knowing that a whole bunch of people are reading it with me, has really added a dimension that I confess at the beginning of the Iliad read-along, I wasn't expecting that would happen. I've read these things, I read them every year, and I've read them so many times that I guess I thought I couldn't feel anything new about the experience itself. I would still love the reread, but this has been different, knowing that you're all coming at this from dozens and dozens of different angles and dozens of different versions and mind frames. I just love it. So I'm eager to hear your reactions to this. This is, in many ways, the heart of the modern conception of the Odyssey. These are the stories that we associate with the Odyssey. That was not true in the ancient world. The ancient world loved those stories, of course, but they cared most of all about the conclusion of this poem. That was everything to them. I don't think it strikes as basic a note with 21st century readers, but I'd be curious to know. We'll see when we get there, because that's what we're going to do next time. We're going to read the next 6 books, all taking place in Ithaca, and all repeating several of the same ideas. There's a pattern that recurs in the next 6 books. You're going to notice it. I think you're going to love it if you haven't encountered it already. It's something Homer does really well. I'm in the drastic minority with the Odyssey. The vast majority of people who read this poem even once, much less many times, love the beginning part more than they love the end. I love the second half of this poem more than I love the first half. But one way or another, I'm curious to know what you made of it all. What did you expect this? That it was all going to be in the course of 2 books, that you would get all of these famous stories, or were you expecting that they would be stretched out, that they would get more dramatic prominence? And while you're telling me all that, and while you're relating your own experiences with these 6 books of the Odyssey, and getting ready for the next 6 books, we'll read. The next will be 12 through 18. And then 18 through 24. But while you're doing all that, keep the suggestions coming for our next read-along. We are now halfway through August's read-along, and we still don't have a September book. Keep in mind, our September read-along is different from those very fortunate, happy few of you who received jury duty summons to my mandatory buddy read for September. That's different. That's a different thing. We're still going to do a read-along for everybody in September, and we don't have a book yet. I would like it to be something in the common domain, so it doesn't cost anybody anything. And I don't know. Well, you've heard my reservations on this channel many times in the last year. I increasingly grow restive with reading works from the ancient world or any other world in translation. It increasingly bothers me. Even when I like the translation, I increasingly notice that there's somebody else in the room, and that I'm hearing a mumbled version of the original, and then I'm hearing them mumble the original back to the original speaker to make sure they got it right, and then they're saying it to me, and I'm not believing that I'm getting the original. I guess the long way of saying, in addition to being something in the common domain, it might be nice if this next time around we read something that wasn't translated, something that was just in English. But I'm listening to all the suggestions. I'm mulling over all sorts of possibilities on my own, so keep them coming by all means. And that's it. That is our second read-along, part 2 of our read-along of the Odyssey for 2018. And the reason that I stress the year with both the Iliad and the Odyssey is because, of course, next year I will be doing this again. So we'll have all sorts of new things to say. But in the meantime, you know the drill. Let me know what you made of these 6 books, and then get cracking on the next 6 books, where Odysseus finally comes home and finds there a nest of troubles. His wanderings might be over, but his adventures are not. So we'll reconvene next Sunday, and we'll talk all about that. But in the meantime, I will wrap this up, and I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.